Alberta Premier Danielle Smith last night sounding off against federal discussions aimed at resettling asylum seekers across the country in an effort to ease the burden on Ontario and Quebec. Smith argues her province doesn't have the capacity to meet federal resettlement numbers, an argument also being made by her counterparts in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan. The feds today did announce changes to another stream of temporary immigration, international student permits. Starting next year, the government will cut the number of permits issued by another 10%. The new target for 2025 and 2026 will be 437,000 permits. In 2024, the target is 485,000 permits. Earlier this year, the feds announced a 2-year cap on international students. To talk more about all of that, joining us live is Immigration Minister Marc Miller. Minister, good to see you again. Thank you very much for making the time.
Nice to see you, Vassy.
I think this is the second time since the beginning of the year that we have talked about a sort of cut to international student, what amounts to a cut to international student permits. I wondered if this is the end of the line or if you anticipate you'll have to make further cuts in the future.
Yeah, and it's not only just to the international student program and putting a cap on it and sort of rationalizing it, making it fair across the provinces, with Ontario and BC having done taken more than their lion's share of international students. We've tried to make this fair. We've tried to make it fair in the optic of the spouses that come in with some of these folks, and with the postgraduate work permits that come with them. So it's a bit more of an ecosystem than just cutting students. But we made an announcement, a very important affordability announcement earlier in March, to bring the number of temporary residents down from 7%, which it is now, to 5%. Bank of Canada rightly said there needed to be policies to underpin that. We did a portion of that. We think these measures, as announced, there are about 6 or 7 measures that I announced today, will reach us to that 5%. Now, we will only feel that probably in the second quarter of 2025, but the measures today complement the ones that I announced in January, and we're already seeing the results in some areas where there's lots of students with rents coming down. They are tentative in nature, so we have to kind of wait and see. But we think they make sense. First of all, they restore the integrity of the international student visa system that had admittedly gotten overheated. And they're ones I think we can be quite proud of when they're put into effect and work. And so we'll monitor those things constantly. But these measures today, I think, should be the ones, at least substantively, that we'll be materially announcing in the next little while.
And do you anticipate that you'll have to augment that 5% target at all, or do you think that that is the number that, essentially, for lack of a better term, society has the capacity to absorb?
Well, we're constantly tracking these things, and the concept of absorptive capacity has been more or less used for political purposes. It's very hard to define. It is the pressure on the healthcare system. Is it the pressure on housing? We know that the impact and volume of immigration, temporary or permanent, has an impact on affordability, but it's been very sort of hard to pin it down, and there's no economist that can actually do that in a quantitative way. It becomes more of a qualitative assessment, but we're working on it. We know that volume needs to come down. We know that the system's gotten overheated, and particularly in the area of international students and the postgraduate work permits that come with it, which compose about half of the temporary residents in Canada, and we need a system that actually makes sense that we can continue to be proud of.
So just to be clear, are you basing your actions on a qualitative assessment or a quantitative one? Because, for example, the Bank of Canada has just written a note this week assessing the quantitative impact of immigration, in particular on the housing sector. Their conclusion, as I read it, was that it did have a tangible impact on the availability of affordable housing, less of a tangible impact, if none at all, on wages and a lot of the things people have been talking about on the temporary worker side, which is something you've also started to address. So are you making the decisions based on numbers or just pushback from, as you would put it, for political purposes?
Well, there's a couple of things going on there. When in the international student visa model, it's a bit of both. Obviously, the volume was too high. That needs to, and we did curtail it. But we also want an international visa student that actually attracts students and not people looking to do other things, looking to get low-wage jobs. It was a question of short-term gain with a lot of long-term pain coming with it, with provinces and the institutions that they regulate not having a proper assessment of what the long-term needs of the province were, of the institutions in question, and sort of just bagging the quick money and running with it and stranding people in this country that had perhaps been sold a false bill of goods. The range of quality between those institutions, between U of T's, McGill's, UBC's, and sort of the really shady ones is quite great. So making sure that we are asserting our responsibility federally, and making sure provinces who've been told by their auditors general time and time again to get a grip on the regulation of these institutions also do their job. So there's a lot of things in the mix here, but the measures that we instituted today, as well as the ones that we did in January, I think make sense. They're responsive to what Canadians want, and it's the federal government looking at the situation and getting a rein on it.
I know you have a hard out in 2.5 minutes, so I would like to ask you more about that. I want to move on to us. Are you sure? I don't want to get it because I just want to follow. I do want to follow up on the issue of sort of on what you're making your decisions. And in particular, you're talking about the temporary side of things. But when we last spoke, it was at Cabinet and you were entertaining the possibility or broaching the possibility of looking at the permanent stream of immigration as well. Right after that, I interviewed Mike Moffat, who was presenting to you in Cabinet, and I asked him, based on the absorptive capacity in housing specifically, like what that cut would have to look like, because you said it wouldn't be cosmetic, it would be significant if it happens. He said, in order to sort of temporarily over the next few years be able to meet what the supply of housing is, you would have to go from a plan of 500,000 permanent immigrants to 300 or 200 a year, 200,000 a year. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Well, currently we're looking at a number of options, Vassy, and I'm not going to speak out of turn. We still have to have this discussion in Cabinet, but we're looking at a model that would look at reductions. We're looking at models that have other options to them, and it's really a discussion that needs to have a proper discussion at Cabinet. As we look at the impact of immigration, we still have an aging demographic when it comes to our workforce. It's something we have to look at in a generational perspective, but without dismissing the conundrum that's come with that on affordability, on housing, on what Mike Moffat talks a lot about, particularly on social media. Those are important conversations. We also have to weigh what these potential impacts or decisions will have on the economy and the recessionary impact that this could have. And so responsibly, we have to actually look at those numbers. Were we to go back to Stephen Harper numbers, that would be an irresponsible, I think, approach to immigration. It may be one that is weaponized and used by political parties. But quantitatively, we know that the numbers that
or a qualitative assessment?
Well, it's a bit of both. But in terms of the volume itself, quantitatively, we know that the numbers that Stephen Harper had were unsustainable. We needed immigration in order to make the workforce younger. The Bank of Canada has highlighted that. The IMF has highlighted that we've avoided 2 recessions because of it. We also have to look at that quality of the migration that's come and the impact that that's had on different areas, looking at housing affordability, healthcare, the impact on provinces that the provinces highlight. So having that rational conversation without sort of incessantly pointing fingers at people and calling them names, I think is super important, and it actually is reflective of the conversations that we have around the dinner table or whenever we gather with our close ones.
But my questions are based in rationality. Like, I'm not asking on behalf of a political party. I'm asking after having interviewed, people who are looking at the housing market and what has happened and the impact it's had, not just on people who have lived here for a long time, but those very immigrants who are coming here and unable to find a home. And that's why I'm asking if you think it's reasonable. I take from your comments that even for a few years, it would be too drastic of a cut to go back to those levels, in your view, even if it makes housing more sustainable?
We have to, you obviously have to look at the impact that would have in the short term. Housing is one of the considerations. It is a major consideration, but it isn't the only one. There are important steps we have to make the interest rates go down. When the interest rates going down, make housing more affordable. So it's multifaceted in nature. There's no doubt that the volume is having an impact, and we have a responsibility to address it. I'm a little constrained about what I can speak about publicly right now, Vassy. I spoke to a lot of economists about what their views are. They don't necessarily agree all the time with Mike Moffat. They'll agree with whatever the Bank of Canada might not agree with the Bank of Nova Scotia or RBC. They have different views, but we owe it to them to have those conversations with them and actually have an active debate with them as we take into all the other considerations that we have to take into account when we announce the levels on November 1st. So you'll sort of have to wait till November 1st, but glad to continue.
I look forward to it. No, I appreciate it. I just very quickly, if I could get you on asylum seekers and the argument being made by Danielle Smith, Premiers Danielle Smith, Blaine Higgs, Tim Houston, and now Scott Moe. Just to get you on the record, are you moving asylum seekers from Ontario and Quebec to those provinces?
Not without anyone's consent. And I think what they've done is, and I sort of joked about it in French today, is they kind of spending a little too long watching the American presidential elections and are kind of running with that on their own private WhatsApp group and saying, good gosh, Justin Trudeau's sending all sorts of asylum seekers to our jurisdiction. They have a working group that they told us to form and participate in as part of the Council of the Federation. They're making the Council of the Federation look like a joke because they came out of that and they said, we need to do something on asylum seekers. Provinces have a role. Let's get together and do something. I got together with my immigration ministers of the provinces. We looked at different models, and they went and leaked a bunch of information that makes no sense. And they're running with it, saying that we're going to spend thousands of immigrants or asylum seekers into their communities. That's absolutely false. We looked at models that make sense around the world. If a consenting provinces lifts up their hand and says, hey, we'll take some, we'll take the money, and we'll work together on making sure these people are properly supported, then we'll work with them. But there has never been any question of the federal government imposing this on them. They're using it for their own re-election scheme campaign or their leadership review. It's transparent, and I think it's kind of distasteful.
So just to be clear, there aren't going to be any asylum seekers that the federal government moves to a province without that province's consent. Is it that black and white?
Pretty much so, and it's even crazy to suggest that we put that on the table. We worked with, and their own ministers, they should talk to them, looked at what asylum seekers would look like as a proportion of the population if every province had the amounts that proportionally Ontario and Quebec should have. Quebec and Ontario are doing more than their fair share, and so they ran with those numbers opportunistically. It sort of undermines our working group. It undermines the good relationship we had. It puts into question the pertinence of this group, and sadly, it's being weaponized for political purposes. I think we owe it to anyone on this that comes here to Canada for whatever reason to take a humanitarian approach. Right now, Ontario and Quebec are doing more than their fair share. The federal government has a clear responsibility to bring the volume of asylum seekers down. We're moving on that. The provinces that have the effective responsibility and jurisdiction over healthcare, over the services that asylum seekers would seek immediately, have a responsibility. We're willing to help. We put $1 billion on the table for someone to lift up their hand and say, hey, we'll work at it. But it has to be in a little more coordinated way than it's currently done, and we expect provinces to step up.
Minister, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate your time this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vassy.